Okay, great. Good morning. My name is Will Pomeranz, Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute. And just a brief couple announcements about upcoming events next week. Our last group of meetings before we break for the holidays. On Monday, December 14th from 10 to 11:30. We will have another in our joint program with the Kissinger Institute on China and Russia on their own terms. And we will have Professor Yafing Xiao from Long Island University and Sergei Zhuk from the Department of History at Ball State University talking about Russian and Chinese historical perspectives on the United States. And then next Wednesday on December 16th from 10 to 11:30, we will have our book launch on Roots of Russia's War in Ukraine, where we'll have the four authors, Wayne Murray, Maxim Trudolubov, Elizabeth Wood, and myself, talking about the book and how events have changed since the three of the participants gave a talk here in March. Today we're extremely pleased to have Professor Konstantin Sonin here, who is a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. He is well known to everyone who has followed Russian economics and Russian politics. He previously served on the faculty of the New Economic School and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and previously was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Professor Sonin writes a blog on Russian political and economic issues and is a columnist for the Russian language newspaper Vedomosti. He earned an MSc and a PhD in mathematics from Moscow State University and an MA in economics at Moscow's New Economic School. And today, Professor Sonin is here to talk about the outlook for Russia's economy. So, Professor Sonin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about the Russian economy in 2015. This is the first slide. I just acknowledge the sources of my data that I use. So, very briefly, the Russian economy in 2015, this needs a caveat, because a lot of things that happened in the last 18 months were somewhat unexpected. Actually, it was unexpected to the extent that I did not know a Russia watcher or Russian commentator, either in Russia or outside Russia, who predicted what happened in 2014. So if you know such a name or you think you were such a person, just send me a link to the work that predicted the events of 2014. Of course, there were a kind of some people who were saying, like Russia is an evil empire, it will attack its neighbors, then Finland, then Sweden. They were saying this all along for 20 years. They were absolutely right, yes. But otherwise, a lot of things were unexpected. So I myself constantly remind myself and my listeners that I need to be kind of more cautious about talking about the present and the future, even if my concern is the economy only. So, in brief, the economy is doing badly, GDP is contracting, and the investment is falling, and basically any measure of economic activity is going down in 2015. And this is the first year in 16 years when the real income falls, and the real income fallen by probably more than 10%, which is a significant amount. And for a lot of people in Russia, this is the first time in their working life when they see such a fall in the real income. Since we have especially high inflation in food, the poor part of the population is disproportionately affected. So most of the commentary you hear are probably complaints of people who live in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. But the other part of Russia is affected even more economically than those who complain. Also, I think we need to focus on the economic government, because basically it's almost non-existent in the last 2 years, since President Putin and administration is totally preoccupied with foreign affairs and wartime activities. Nobody cares about the economic development. But the main message of my talk is going to be the following: that we now in Russia have like two crises, and one is short term. It's the current crisis. The reason why we see a contracting GDP, falling investment, things like this. Why we see like acute symptoms of a crisis. But this is short term, and there is no reason to expect that it will not end very shortly. But also that we have a kind of a long-term crisis, which is already in place for maybe 7 or 8 years, and this is a much more important thing for the Russian economy than this short-term crisis. So, the plan for this half an hour: I'll show you the economic history of Russia in one slide for 150 years. This will explain, among many other things, it will explain the reasons for growth in early Putin years, in the first 8 years of his rule, and then we will talk about deep causes of the deep long-term crisis. So, this is absolutely academic. Actually, this is a slide where on which I start my political economy classes. But still, this is important because without it, it will be hard to focus on important issues. This is about what the long-term growth is. Here we have GDP per capita, the main indicator of economic activity for two countries, Sweden and Argentina, over 100 years, over the 20th century. If you take average growth rates of GDP per capita, you will see that the difference was very small. It was slightly above 2 for Sweden, slightly less than 1 for Argentina. But these countries started the 20th century at the same point, and they ended in two different worlds. This is the first world. Here in the United States, it's also a first world, and this is what was long ago called third world, but it's certainly in another world. It's developing world. And if you look at the history of these countries, you would not see any point in which there was like a critical divergence, where the moment they went like so much apart that you could see this was a bifurcation point, so we diverted. There was no such point. Just to say that long-term growth is an extremely important thing. This is what determines the well-being of people living in the country. But this is something that's very hard to comment on and to observe in the real time. So now, economic history of Russia in one slide. This is the end of 19th century. This is the early 21st century. If you look at this graph, and this is a product of work of even generation of economic historian, you will see that 20th century for Russia was basically two event century. There were two major events economically. One is the revolution and the civil war and its consequences. And another is the 1990 crisis and the fall of the Soviet Union. Even the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was not an important thing economically. You see in this graph, you could read a lot of things. This is the big terror. This is the Holodomor and the big terror. So it was not a negligible thing. This is the Stalin's growth, and you see that's the only reason why Russia was growing at a rate higher than the trend line is the size of this fall. And basically this tells you the story of the growth in the early Putin years. It was just a restoration from the huge fall, like historically rare event of an economic collapse of such proportion in peaceful times. So basically, high growth of The early Putin years is about idle labor force and idle manufacturing capacity, which was freed by this fallen GDP there. So now, look at what happened since 2008. Here we have Russia's growth rate, and these are all the proper peers. We see the 2009 crisis. This is the current crisis. Basically, what I want to show with this slide is that growth in Russia basically stalled on average since 2008. Since 2008, Russia grows at the rate which is lower than the growth rates in Brezhnev era, what we called zastoy after it's ended. So it's just not growing at all. I do not expect you to read the data on these pictures. I just wanted my pictures to convey a very broad message. Here is unemployment. That's 90s. This is now. So basically, unemployment went down, and there is no spare labor capacity. This is what's so-called capacity utilization. Again, this is 90s. This is now. There is no longer spare capacity. This is investment. It was growing in all these Putin years when we have free industrial capacity and we have idle labor. Okay, it stopped at the moment when we no longer have idle capacity both in labor market and production. So that's another illustration for the same message. Since 2010, so even not counting the fall in 2008, 2009, there was almost no growth in manufacturing. This is less than 1% per year. There is almost no growth in raw materials extraction, despite high oil prices, which were high for years in this part, and energy production and things that are relevant to personal consumption, they actually fallen down over this period. This is a very difficult slide, so this is just a reminder to myself to tell you what is going on in the labor market. There is one sector which does extremely well in comparison to other markets to other sectors since 2008. And this is the non-market, the government sector. So basically, these slides show that since 2008, the real wages, the real income of people working for government, especially in military and security service, increased dramatically. So, like when one wonders how it could be that you have a fallen GDP, fallen production, and very high employment. Okay, this is all government employment. This is increase in both real incomes and employment in the government sector. So the last part of this picture, the way the economic decisions are made in Russia these days in 2015 needs another caveat, is that economic policy is very hard to analyze, not because a lot of data became secret, and now we have much more secret data than we had like 5 years ago, but also that rhetoric is highly deceptive. I'm not saying that economic ministers or finance ministers or the central bank, they're trying to deceive the public or someone. No, it's rather than we are developing a kind of a special way of talking about economic issues which are almost unreadable for an outsider. Basically, if you look at President Putin's public announcement and his speeches before the Federal Assembly, then he would always talk about privatization for 15 years. And yet, the last 10 years, we witnessed the largest nationalization, largest peaceful nationalization in world history, probably. And the same thing applies basically to everything. You could have 15 years of talk about the pension reforms, but basically what is going on, it's the reverse of the pension reforms. If you see a talk about a reform of regional municipal finance, again, that's probably just the opposite. So it's difficult to analyze words. But then I think that the distinctive feature of economic decision-making in the last 2 years is that a lot of major economic decisions are made with little input from economic ministers. So trade policy, tariff policy, all kinds of things about protectionism, these decisions are made with no input at all from economic minister, finance minister, from parliament. Parliament is not involved in budgetary discussion, and the cabinet is also bypassed. I will talk a little bit more about counter-sanctions at the end of my talk. And of course, corruption is rampant. I mean, when you talk corruption, when you say corruption is rampant, then it became a kind of so much part of life and so much part of presentations about Russia that people start not to pay attention to this. But actually, if you look at data, if you just put Russia on the world map of on the world map in terms of corruption, then Russia is a huge outlier. I mean, compared to Venezuela, Brazil, other countries, it has a kind of Latin American countries' level of GDP per capita and development of basically almost everything, but it has a kind of worst African countries' measures of corruption. So, despite this is present in all slides about the Russian economy, believe me, there is a reason for this. This is kind of I don't know how to illustrate this message. I could say you the following. I tried to look at the list of the cabinet ministers in Russia, and although I know some people, I think some people are very good ministers. I think some people do their job very well, but I have not found a single person who would not be personally corrupt, meaning owning business in the area that he regulates. So that's just, if someone could find such a minister, again, send me an email with a link, and I will Google his wife holding in the area that he or she regulates. Then, closing the discussion of 2014 and 2015. Here is a graph where the blue line is the so-called output gap, a measure of short-term fluctuations in the economy, and this is the oil price changes, and this is the world oil prices. Just for your information, just to remind, the oil price fallen by 50% during the last year, and this thing is that many economists in Russia they kind of surprised. It seems that almost nothing affects the Russian economy in short term except for the oil prices. Like if you look at the residual of other factors, it seems that even crazy government policy doesn't influence anything. That the only thing that matters is the oil price change. So of course, since mid 2014, the world oil prices fallen down. This, of course, produced what we see now in terms of fallen GDP and in other measures of economic activities. But again, I'm trying to say that the main crisis that the Russian economy faces is this long-term crisis, and I want to spend some time talking about this. But this will not take 25 years. It will be a short. It will be like a short tour through this. So 25 years, it was like generally understood that high growth rates, sustainable economic development requires good institutions, that you need to have politically independent courts, that you need to have efficient law enforcement, you need to have non-corrupt regulators. And of course, all of these things, they were new. And of course, all of these things, they were created back in 90. Some of them were created by the government, sometimes with huge involvement of Western advisors. Some of the things developed from grassroots. They developed naturally. But the main thing is that it happened like this. First, these institutions were created. Then they developed for a couple of years until mid-90s. And then basically the institutional development completely stalled. So if you look at measures at measures of institutional development, again, I'm not expecting you to read anything on these slides. The only thing that I want to say that whatever measure you take, they were not changing since 1995 until 2008. Basically, it was flat on every measure. Some of these measures are very kind of micro-oriented. Some of them are drawn from expertise. But again, at any measure, if you look at them, there were no institutional development between 1995 and 2008. And this is my favorite slide made by my former colleagues and my friends Sergei Guriev and Ekaterina Zhuravskaya 5 years ago. For these 5 years, I'm using this slide, changing only this part. So it was 1-year-old slide, 2-year-old slide. Like in 10 years, it will be 15 years old slide. So at this slide made 5 years ago in 2010, they just plotted the Russia's GDP per capita and Korea GDP per capita. This is Russia. The violet is Korea. The only catch is that the Korean data is 11 years earlier than the Russian data. So this kink is 2008 crisis for the Russian economy, and 1997 the Asian crisis for the Korean economy. And since Korea is one of the wonders of the 20th century, it's a growth leader. It's a country which started very low, but now it's as developed in economic terms and in many other respects as West European countries. It's a very good thing to compare. The only catch with this graph in Guriev and Zhuravskaya article in 2010 was that this Russian part was, of course, a kind of projected. It was non-existent at the time when they wrote this article. But they also observed that if you look at basic measures of institutions, corruption, rule of law, regulatory quality, the government effectiveness, then Russia ranks much lower than South Korea. And it's exactly what happened. This is the actual data for the Russian economy. This is if Russia were South Korea. So they asked the question, is Russia the next Korea? And now we have with each 1 year an answer which basically confirms our suspicions that institutions matter for economic development, and the lack of institutional development became a major constraint on Russian growth. So then, now that we now that I said that institutions matter, then if we make a step backward and ask ourselves, where do institutions come from? That's a good question. Economic institutions are obviously designed and put in practice within a political process. And what economists know about this, that good institutions, they might be based politically on two things. First, we are absolutely sure that good institutions might be based on mature democratic institutions. And also there is a lot of evidence that they could be based politically on something else. So they are not necessarily based on mature democratic institutions. So there are some alternative models of political regimes. For example, Mexico had an institutionalized ruling parties. There were institutionalized one-party dictatorship and communist regime. There is obviously an example of China, and this is an extremely important example, obviously. Then also, the only thing that we know about the relationship between political regimes and economic institutions, that good economic institutions are never based on personalistic, non-democratic regimes. So it might be that good institutions and sustainable economic development might be based on a non-democratic regime. There is a good evidence in favor of this thing. But also we know for sure that in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, this is not sustainable. So what we have in Russia, I'm not going to talk about politics, basically, because as I said, a year ago I thought that I understand everything, and now I think I understand almost nothing. But some things are safe. It's a personalized autocratic regime. There is a leader in power for a long time. The regime relies on repression, which puts in doubt that the leaders are as popular as some opinion survey suggests. There is certainly no well-organized opposition. So, what does it all say? What does it all say about the Russia's prospects going forward? Basically, it says that with the current regime, there is no hope of any kind of institutional development. Consistent with that, there are no talks and there is no concerns about institutional development. There is no talks about devolution of political power. There is no concern about less government involvement in, say, court cases, or less presidential administration involvement in court cases. Now we deal with this crisis caused by the fall in the oil prices. There are obviously some negative consequences of Crimea and sanctions. They both produce the same checklist. Both sanctions and what happened in Crimea, this lowers business confidence, increases capital outflow, this raised the cost of financing for banks and companies, that lead to make imports even more expensive than they become because of the oil prices. There is a certain kind of a brain drain. There are some brains who were drained out of Russia, but this is probably doesn't matter that much. The main problem is this long-term growth stop. I want to spend one slide talking about one concrete step, one concrete measure, one specific measure that the Russian government undertaken in the last year and a half, basically because I think it's a kind of very well illustrates what is wrong with the economic governance in Russia today. Again, I do not think that this wrong policy had a kind of a major impact, because, as I said, the drop in oil prices dwarfs everything. It dwarfs sanctions, it dwarfs consequences of Crimea, both fiscal and business climate implications. It also dwarfs the consequences of this misguided policy. But still, since August 2014, the government implemented a number of measures restricting import. There were counter-sanctions on food imports, basically prohibiting import from European countries, the United States, and some other countries. There are a lot of restrictions on technology imports, and there's a rising number of restrictions on technology imports. The supposed aim of this is to generate large-scale import substitution, and of course these measures are extremely profitable for owners of enterprises and protected industry. These measures do not make any sense. They do not work theoretically, because theoretically this thing, the import substitution undertaken on a large scale, should result in higher prices. This makes all consumers, both industrial consumers and people having less money for everything else. This lowers aggregate demand, so it contracts basically both import and domestic production. And I'm a theorist academically, so believe me, if something doesn't work in theory, it cannot work in practice. In Russia, people do not believe this, but also this theoretical proposition is supported by every single example of a similar policy. Every single example of large-scale import substitution resulted in a huge drop in aggregate demand and contraction in production. This thing is also kind of anti-poor, because obviously the food ban resulted in higher prices of food, and the poor are disproportionately affected by this, because the poor half of the Russian population spends about 40 to 45 or maybe even 50% of their income on food. This means that when the food prices are rising higher than the overall inflation measures, this means that those who spend more on food, they are hurt more. So this is a kind of a puzzle for people who study political issues, because this measure should be also highly unpopular. Also, this is an interesting case for those who study lobbyism, because, in academia, in academic papers, when we write about lobbyist influence, we have a model where we have a lot of models. There are Nobel Prizes awarded for these models. We have a model where you have business, a special interest group, and you have a politician, and there is a kind of interaction between them. But here, the main proponent of the import substitution in agricultural production, in food production, is Alexander Tkachev, who is both the Minister of Agriculture in the cabinet, and also his family is the owners of the largest agricultural holding in Russia. So all these academians with these models of a business and a politician, that's just junk. You need to model when it's just one person, right? Okay, so this is my last slide. Economically, Russia obviously faces serious short-term challenges. It needs new investment, it needs a better climate, it needs better financial sector, it needs more trade, more openness, more basically everything. It needs substantial political reforms, but at the same time, on all of these frontiers, it moves in the wrong direction. So if the oil prices drop further, then the Russian economy will continue to contract. If the oil prices stay the same or are not rising at a pace fast enough, then the Russian economy will stagnate for years to come, and for those historically inclined, this should remind very much the 70s and early 80s.
Well, thank you very much, Konstantin. Yes, indeed. There's much obviously to talk about. I'd like to begin with a question that maybe you might be able to answer. Did Putin, obviously at the present time, as you mentioned, he's not really listening to economists and they're not part of the discussion. But at some point during his presidency, did he listen to economists? Did he take into account what they said? And at what point did he decide no longer to listen to them?
I'm not sure that it's my comparative advantage to psychoanalyze Vladimir Putin, but still,
I'm just asking who we talked to.
Just as any Russian Russia watcher and commentator, of course, I have my own model of President Putin, President Putin thinking. I think that for all 15 years, President Putin treated economists as like normal people treat doctors. So he thinks themselves as being professionals, and he would never appoint a non-professional to economic position, unlike what President Yeltsin did, unlike what happened during Gorbachev and earlier years. All the Putin's appointees in economic sphere, they are professional economists. But at the same time, I mean, sometimes a person could think that his or her health is not a major concern, and doctors have nothing to say unless he would come to them to the advice. So I think recently, for the last couple of years, President Putin just do not consult with economists. He just is not concerned with this. So they are good. He trusts them on economic matters, but he just do not think that economics matter is something important. So when he thinks about food ban, when he thinks about trade restrictions, then he just doesn't consult economists.
Bill.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm Bill Veal. I'm President Emeritus of the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. You didn't mention the central bank, and I wonder if you could talk about the role the central bank has played in this process, and if you could also comment on its relative truthfulness in presenting statements and facts about the economy.
Okay, I'm a great fan of the Russian central bank. Basically, what the central bank in any country does, they do monetary policy and they do banking regulation. I think on banking regulation, the current leadership of the central bank, they started cleaning up the Russian banking sectors 2 years ago when they came to the helm, and they made enormous progress, meaning that they are revoking, I think, on average, two licenses per day, and every time they revoke a license, it's very clear that this license should have been revoked like 10 years ago. That's, I mean, actually, there is almost nothing for the banking authority to do there. It's just to have a criminal prosecution of the bank owners. On monetary policy, the 2008 crisis, it demonstrated very clearly, and Russia was very much affected. It demonstrated very clearly the dangers for Russia of having a fixed exchange rate. Basically, with the fixed exchange rate, we increased unemployment but we doubled unemployment in 2 months, and the fall in production was the largest among the 20 industrialized nations. So about 3 years ago, the central bank moved to the floating exchange rate, and nobody noticed until in 2014, as a reaction to the changed oil prices, it's called ruble or ruble?
Ruble.
Ruble. No, sorry. Ruble devalued by half, and obviously everyone in the country focused on this. At this point, for the central bank, it was kind of difficult. It's a kind of difficult to explain that this fluctuation of the exchange rate. It's basically what protects jobs, that protects production, that protects firms, that protects basically everything. To his credit, President Putin has always supported the central bank leadership, as he supported conservative macroeconomic policy over the 15 years. So, everyone is very, very unhappy with the central bank. Although it's obvious that if we entered 2014 with a fixed exchange rate, then by mid-October a year ago, 2014, we would have no reserves and we would have to abandon fixed exchange rate non-voluntarily, just because this change in external conditions. We needed a kind of $1 trillion reserves to support this, not 500 billion dollars. So on these two frontiers, the central bank does very well in very adverse circumstances. Also, they're making a kind of a silent revolution. In the last 2 years, they started to produce and publish analytics which has never been produced in the last 10 years by a Russian think tank or anything like this. So before that, most of hard analysis that Russian authorities rely or could have relied on was done by IMF or the World Bank or private consultants. Now the central bank changes this, and they do what central bank in developed countries do. So I'm a great fan of the central bank, but the central bank is just one government vehicle. It cannot solve growth problems.
Right here.
Ron Davis, retired State Department analyst. How hard have Russian business conglomerates, formerly known as oligarchs, or maybe still known, how badly have they been hit, and does President Putin care? Does it matter?
Okay, one thing that I need to know, that oligarchs is a kind of intellectual, to some extent, an intellectual concept rather than like a real thing. So sometimes some of these oligarchs, when they read about how much influence they had in the 90s, they're like genuinely surprised that it was them who shaped the policy. I would say that those who were very big businessmen in Yeltsin era, they kind of faded in political obscurity. Some of them survived, and some of them are still very, very rich people. Some of them run very big businesses. Some of them meet Putin regularly. But I think they are not, in a sense, they're not influential. And in the last couple of years, I think their positions and their advice was a kind of trivial. So, like, if they were asked about Ukraine, they would advise not to go to. If they were asked about Syria, they would advise not to go to. So perhaps President Putin didn't ask them for their advice just because he obviously knew what they would say. And the new oligarchy, the billionaires who were part of Putin entourage, they are of course all out. They're an extension of Putin in a sense.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Hande Akmehmet, I'm an independent economist. So I was wondering if you have any estimations on the recent Russian sanctions that the Kremlin has imposed on the Turkish economy, and including the import restrictions that are coming along the way. Do you see that this is also going to hurt the Russian economy back? And there are talks that there might be increased amount of sanctions coming along the way. In your opinion, won't all these sanctions really impose additional costs on the Russian economy, given the recent depreciation in the ruble, Federal Reserve's upcoming interest rate hike line, and the whole emerging market situation? Thank you.
Okay, a general answer is very simple. Like any trade sanctions, they're costly for the country that imposes them. So the whole idea when the United States or European Union imposes sanctions on some country, it's not that there is no cost for the United States or the European Union. The thing is that the Iranian economy or South African economy is much smaller than the United States economy. So if the relative losses are roughly the same, then the relative cost for the target country is much larger. So the cost of Russian economy of trade sanctions against Turkey is, I think, a rough estimate that it's as high as the cost for Turkey. And I personally think this is a kind of a crazy thing to impose trade sanctions against Turkey at this moment. I mean, if I were that crazy, I would probably wish could do something military. This would be a proper retaliation, because the Russian economy is not in the state where you could add additional percentage points to food inflation. It might be just 0.1 additional point to the food inflation, but for half of the population, even this 0.1 point for the food inflation is a kind of an important thing. This is this is a real cost, and again, I think this Turkey sanctions ban it disproportionately affects the poor part of the Russian population, so the poor half. But again, every time there is a talk about trade sanctions, there is a kind of a small private interest, which is very big relative to the losses to each individual among public. So there are always happy lobbyists for any kind of sanctions, and the Turkey sanctions are no exception to this. But okay, if you need to estimate, I think the losses to the Russian economy is in terms of low single billions of dollars, which is nothing for the Russian economy, nothing for people. But this is a loss, and you can not look at this as if this were a benefit.
Okay. I see, let's say 2 questions apiece here. So Isabella, and then one in the back, and then we'll take these 2 next.
Isabella Tabarovsky from the Kennan Institute. One thing that I think we all assume here in the West, that if an economy doesn't do so well, then the consumers begin to respond and they want to react, and maybe there are political actions. But certainly the consumer doesn't stay happy and the political leader doesn't stay popular. And in Russia, it seems like things are getting worse, and you're obviously saying consumers are being affected, but the popularity of Putin stays high. Are the Russian people made of some other kind of dough? I don't know. Is that...
No, obviously...
Let's take one more question here in the back, and then we'll get the 2 questions together.
So revolution.
No.
Thank you for your presentation. Daryl Stanner spent the last 20 years in Moscow working commercial real estate investment. You listed various countries as possible models. I know that Medvedev, Shuvalov, Itagdali have studied Singapore a lot as a model. Please compare Russia to Singapore, and what can Russia learn from Singapore's model of economic development? That's one question. And then the second is, Russia, as you know, has 89 regions. They're very different. Can you cite any examples of regional political climates or economic climates that offer hope as a model for Russia in general?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first because it's a kind of a well-rehearsed answer. Singapore is obviously one point among many observations. So one may think that this is just an exception. That's like there are dozens of books on success stories, but it might be that a success story is just an exception of the rule, that there is no lesson to draw from it. One thing is that Medvedev and Shuvalov might talk about Singapore, but obviously they do not hold the members of the cabinet ministers to the same standard as Lee Kuan Yew hold his ministers. Of course, he allowed his son and his family to be major owners of business and profiteer from this, but he doesn't allow personal corruption of members of his cabinet. And obviously, Medvedev is happy with the personally corrupt members of the cabinet. So I do not know what lesson they take from Singapore and why would they talk about this. An example of a regional differentiation is in Russia is, for example, Kaluga region, which is a resource poor region, and it's a kind of close to Moscow, which is actually a problem. It's like 200 kilometers, and the problem is that the most talented people leave the region for Moscow, but in the last 10 years they put in a huge amount of efforts to attract foreign investors and make normal conditions. I talked to the governor of this region, Alexander Atamonov, and he has a kind of a very standard regional apparatchik background. He's from old party elite. He of course plagiarized his PhD dissertation in economics. I mean, bought wholesale, copy-pasted dissertations. But when I asked him why you put so much effort, I talked to foreign investors with him, so much efforts to bring foreign investors. He just answered in one sentence, I just do not have any oil in my region. So I think basic incentives works, and there are some regions that in which the governments demonstrated very clearly that local efforts to improve business climate, they could work even kind of in an adverse national business climate. So Isabella's question about why Russian consumers' unhappiness do not lead to revolution. I mean, obviously this is a right mechanism. People are unhappy, then they either elect a new leader or make a revolution. But what also we know from history that things might take decades or more. I mean, Russian consumers might be unhappy, but imagine how this logic could be applied to the Soviet Union in early 80s. I mean, they were I'll say late 80s. I mean, we had cards for tobacco and for sugar. I mean, this is already a total economic catastrophe, and still there were no revolution for many years after that. Look at North Korea. This is a kind of an extreme example, but you could have a country where the country basically consists of the extremely poor, huge majority, and a big security and military group of people. And basically that's only they do. They tax population so that they are undernourished and dying of hunger, and they spend it on internal security and military. So I think people in Russia are very unhappy, but there are decades to go in terms of making life harder for the majority of population and to spending on internal security and military.
Okay. We're going to take these three questions. Right there, Victoria, and then over here.
Hi, Carol Colley, Highgate Consulting. Would you talk a little bit about your prognosis for hard currency reserves, especially the two funds that are managed by Ministry of Finance? There have been a lot of reports in the Western media that these funds could really dry up in the next couple of years, just because more and more companies apparently are asking for government assistance. But on the flip side, the last couple of weeks, there have been some reports that Russian companies are more likely and able to tap into international capital markets, and some deals are being teed up for beginning next year. So what is your prognosis for what's going to happen there? Thanks.
Victoria Koroteva, the Cannon Institute. Returning to the long-term perspective, you mentioned that the economy started slowing down in 2008, the growth. So you concentrated on institutional development, and you demonstrated that there were no dramatic institutional changes from '95. So, but what actually happened? Did the model exhaust itself by 2000 and just by inertia? Did the Russian economy not survive the economic crisis? I'm asking this question of you, but I also listened to Sergei Guriev before the Ukrainian events in January 2014, and he did some kind of differential diagnostics, as doctors do. These things are stable, the demographics improves, educational standards are still high, so it's the institutions. So what actually happened, if you exclude other factors, what actually happened with institutions or the model of development that in long-term perspective it slowed down?
And there was one other hand right here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I have a couple of quick questions. So the first one is, you talked about how the 2000s was just kind of the taking back the losses of the 1990s. So I'm wondering if first of all, were the Soviet economic statistics at the late 1980s, were they accurate? And if it was just a regaining, was there any productive restructuring of the economy? And I'm sure they were both very reliant on oil, but did it restructure in any way in the 2000s to something different that was more productive? The other question was about the privatization, nationalization. It seems like that would be, you said that there's a lot of rhetoric for the last 15 years, we've all heard it. It would seem like that would be something that would actually be observable reasonably easily, but maybe not in Russia because nothing's really observable there. And the last one was, sorry, a lot of questions, but about, do you think it makes sense for Russia to reduce imports? Like, to what degree do they need to reduce imports? And thank you.
Okay. Three nice big questions.
Okay, so the reserve fund, there are a couple of issues here. One thing that it's very difficult to track what is happening to the Russian reserve funds. They are reported in an extremely confusing way. So, like, the only part which is controlled by the central bank is kind of reported in a normal way. I need to say that when people say that the reserve funds are going to be exhausted in 3 years, and now the government is on track to spend all of them in 3 years, then this is a kind of, we need to understand what happens when the reserve funds are kind of exhausted. It doesn't mean that the government no longer is able to spend money, because they always could print, for simplicity print, but obviously to finance ministry to borrow from the central bank and maintain the same amount of spending. So basically, having reserve funds is something that allows you to spend money, but not to cause inflation by spending this money. The inflation is already high, mostly because of the oil prices drop. So I think that the Russian government and the Russian government has a capacity to spend, to maintain the current level of spending for many years to come. But I think they will be, it will be visible as low success in fighting inflation. But this, at this point, this will require a kind of a change in policy. But because the macroeconomic policy under Putin was always very conservative. But now it's indeed not clear how they could maintain the same conservatism after these reserve funds are exhausted. Obviously, that the current government plan is somehow reliant on oil prices going back. So the question about institutions is obviously very big. What I tried to say during my presentations, when you have underdeveloped institutions, you could grow because you have spare labor and you have idle capacity in industry. Once you exhausted this possibility, the institutional development is your only source of a source of growth, because to use technological advances, you need to have better institutions than you had before. So the lack of institutional improvement is a constraint on growth today. We could stagnate with the current level of institutions. If the current, the employment falls, if we have more idle capacity, then we could grow a little bit back to the same trend line with the same institutions. But again, there will be this constraint on growth. Now, yes, there are so many good questions in one question there. About Soviet economic statistics. Okay, the Soviet economic statistics was misleading in many ways. And obviously, when we talk about Soviet GDP per capita, it's a kind of a worse GDP per capita than the Russian GDP per capita, meaning that we are interested in GDP per capita because it somehow reflects the quality of life in a country. And the Soviet GDP per capita reflected the quality of life in the Soviet Union less than the United States GDP per capita reflected the quality of life in the United States, or the current Russia's GDP per capita reflects the quality of life. So in 2006, the Russia's GDP per capita reached the Soviet GDP per capita of 1990. But obviously, by all normal measures, the quality of life was much, much higher in 2006 than in the Soviet Union in 1990. If you look at objective measures, subjectively people were much unhappier. So yes, statistics was misleading. Another question: when we talk about growth because of oil, then we really need to talk about the whole mechanism. Oil, it's not just that people who work in the oil industry get more money, meaning that you have more money in the budget, you give more money to pensioners as social spending, which is a large thing for the majority of the Russian population. People spend money on all kinds of goods, so there is a kind of trickle down of oil prices. And of course, there was a lot of restructuring. But basically, the whole consumer industry and the whole service industry, it in a sense. It's in a sense appeared from scratch compared to 1990. But again, to have services, you need to have you need to have idle people to work in these services. When you do not have unemployed people, you need to improve technology, so you free people in other industries so they could join services and the emerging industries. So if there is no improvements in technology, if there is no institutional reason for capital investment, then this is a constraint on development of everything. About observables, yes, we observe a lot of nationalization. Well, I just said that if you hear what Russia's leaders say, then it's like totally divergent from what is actually going on. And we in Russia, we're kind of very high skilled in reading what they say. But sometimes for an outside observer, it might be kind of difficult to read. And the last thing about reducing import, of course, Russia, it would be great to not to reduce import, but somehow to reduce the role of imported goods. But the thing is that restricting trade is the worst policy to reduce imports. I mean, just think about an individual, and if an individual decides that he's going to produce food for himself, just to rely less on things that he purchases in shops, this will have devastating consequences for the well-being of most of us. I don't know. I will be living much worse if I spend time on growing food rather than teaching in the university and talking at round tables.
Yes, well, we encourage you to continue your talking at round tables and not going into the agricultural business, although in Illinois you never know what temptations you might have. We've unfortunately come to the end of our time period, so I again want to express my great thanks to Konstantin for his presentation and discussion of all these various issues, and thank you for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events.